is Caesarean Section Day, but where did this terrifying and life-saving procedure come from? And I mean, the big question is, was Julius Caesar born by C-section? I always assumed that this was the case, but apparently not. There are many theories as to where the name for this surgery comes from, such as the Latin verb cadere, which means to cut, or the fact that Roman law under Caesar stated that any woman who was dead or dying in childbirth had to be cut open to save the baby because they got a population to grow, don't you know? The procedure was known as a Caesarean operation until 1598 when Jacques Guillemeau introduced the section bit in his book on midwifery. Whilst most initial C-sections were not an operation carried out with any intention of preserving the mother's life, the first recorded successful C-section happened shockingly early. It was around 1500. So apparently a Swiss pig gelder and or veterinarian, of course, named Jacob Nuffer, performed the procedure on his wife, who had been in labour for several days, and despite the assistance of 13 midwives, was still unable to deliver the baby. The story goes that the operation was a success. The baby lived to be 77 years old, and his wife, who, of course, we never find out the name of because she isn't also a hero in this story too, went on to have 5 more children, including twins. There is a bit of a question mark over this story though, as it wasn't written down until 1582, so the good Lord above only knows what actually happened. There seems to be an awful lot of first recordeds in the Caesarean section world, so I'm going to share a few of them that I found with you now. In 1738, an Irish midwife named Mary Donnelly performed the first C-section in Britain in which the mother lived. The patient, Alice O'Neill, had been in labour for 12 days and the baby was delivered stillborn. Mary performed the surgery with a razor and had to wait for somebody to walk a mile and back to go and pick up some silk to close the wound. I actually think that I would request that they move like a bit faster than walking if it was me, or maybe I would check that I had some string on me before the dangerous surgery with a razor blade bit. Anyway, a few years later, in 1793, James Barlow was apparently the first person to perform a C-section in Britain where both parties survived. The woman obviously went unnamed because, I mean, what role does she really play in all of this? But we do know that it happened in the village of Blackrod near Bolton. The first Caesarean section performed in the British Empire was in 1826 by Dr. James Barry, a formidable Irishman that Florence Nightingale described as the most hardened creature I ever met throughout the army. He was found upon his death to have female genitalia, but that is a whole nother story that we actually talk about on my podcast, Historical Hot or Not. I'll link it in the comments if you want to have a little look. He's such an interesting guy. But we're not here to talk about him. The C-section was performed on Wilhelmina Munich, and the child was christened James Barry Munich, a name which was passed down through the family, leading to the South African Prime Minister from 1924 to 1939, James Barry Munich Herzog, being named after Dr. Barry. The National Library of Medicine also tells of R.W. Felkin reporting in 1879 that he'd seen a successful C-section in Uganda, in which banana wine was used to both semi-intoxicate the patient, which I absolutely would want. In this scenario, I want all of the fun stuff, please. The banana wine was also used to clean the hands and the abdomen, and they pinned the wound with iron needles and cauterized it to prevent hemorrhaging. But it was medical advances such as hand washing and anaesthesia in the 20th century that really made caesareans more accessible and frequently used. When Dr. Ignace Semmelweis, who I spoke about in my video on Mrs. Beaton, had begun working at Vienna General Hospital, he noticed that there was a marked higher percentage of deaths from childbed fever, aka puerperal sepsis, in the doctor's clinics compared to the midwives' clinics, as many as 31% in December 1842, whereas the midwives were around 7%, to the point that people were preferring to give birth in the street rather than be admitted to the doctor's clinic to give birth. A lot of trial and error went on, but Dr. Semmelweis had noticed that in the mornings, doctors would perform autopsies, and then they would toddle off to the labour wards where they would put their fingers straight into the birthing person's food without having washed their hands in between. Whereas the midwives did not do this. He insisted that doctors wash their hands between these two activities, and everyone hated it. But death rates reduced to between 0 and 4% in 1847, 1848 when he implemented the policy. Unfortunately, despite overwhelming evidence, germ theory was not widely accepted until the end of the 1800s, the early 1900s, and these doctors really did hate washing their hands. It was much easier to just sack Semmelweis in 1849, just let a bunch of people die instead. Semmelweis published his book Etiology, Concept and Prophylaxis of Childbed Fever in 1860, which was ignored until Joseph Lister, inspired by the work of Louis Pasteur, made his discoveries around antiseptic surgery around a similar time. Although he too was initially mocked, Lister's work reduced the mortality rates from major operations from around 40% to under 3% by 1910, just in time for World War One. Hey! Combine this with advancements in anaesthesia, which had a wonderful array of people getting off their faces in the name of science. My favourites are laughing gas parties and ether frolics, which I'd love to go to, which meant that surgery was no longer a case of just getting the patient hammered on booze and then just holding them down. Chloroform was used in the natural birth as opposed to the supernatural birth of Queen Victoria's children in 1853 and 1857. By the early 1900s, anaesthetic was becoming more commonplace. So, if you are having the procedure now, and please do let me know your experiences because I have not had one, what you can expect is that you'll be generally given a spinal or epidural anaesthetic, which will numb you from the waist down so that you can be present in the room as opposed to them knocking you out with general anaesthetic. Your bladder will be emptied with a catheter whilst you're under the anaesthetic and for a little while afterwards until you can feel your legs and your bottom half again. A 10 to 20 centimetre cut below the bikini line is made into the womb. Now, I was surprised by this. I thought that it would be bigger, but there you go. It usually takes 5 to 10 minutes for your baby to be born, and afterwards you'll be given an injection of the hormone oxytocin, which will help your womb to contract and reduce blood loss. Now, dissolvable stitches will be used to close the incision, and the whole procedure will take just shy of an hour usually. Recovery time for this procedure is way longer than a vaginal birth though. It's advised that it takes about 6 to 8 weeks, but it can be much longer depending on various circumstances. It's generally a very safe procedure for everybody involved. There are some potential complications, as there are with all kinds of medical intervention. For example, babies that are delivered by C-section are more likely to have breathing difficulties in their first few days of life, and this is because babies' lungs are full of fluid when they're in the womb. Vaginal birth obviously takes much longer than a caesarean section, giving time for the lungs to clear of fluid and make way for air, but in a C-section the baby comes out quite quickly, so they've got to breathe quickly to get the fluid out of their lungs. Some researchers also suggested that babies born via the sunroof can be a bit more predisposed to allergies due to not being exposed to their mother's gut microbiome through the birth canal. But then other research suggests that this actually might not be as big a problem as first thought, since babies get this from other routes, such as breast milk. The World Health Organization carried out new research which shows the use of C-sections continues to rise globally, and they now account for about 21% of all childbirths. They recommend that C-sections are only used when absolutely necessary, which I assume is largely the case anyway, but I grew up in the 90s and noughties when it felt like the media were out to demonise celebrities like Victoria Beckham, she was a big one, for being too posh to push in 1999, when it was just medically unsafe for her to give birth. Thankfully, the media today don't criticise women for just living their lives though, so it's all good, we fixed it, yay! I don't know how many people in reality are opting for C-sections because it is like the easier option. Because spoilers, it's not. But there are plenty of reasons why C-sections are necessary, such as if the baby is in distress, if the birth is taking too long, if the baby gets stuck, if the mother has got pre-existing health conditions, hemorrhaging, hypertensive disease. The list goes on. And the alternative to a C-section would be that everybody dies. So I'd say that, like, let's get as many of them done as we need. Now, I'd like to end this video with the story of Ines Ramirez Perez. Ines was 40 years old in the year 2000 and had 8 living children. She was living in a one-room cabin which had no electricity, no running water and no sanitation in a remote village in the mountains of southern Mexico. She went into labour and after 12 hours she ran into complications. She was aware of this as 2 years prior she had unfortunately lost a child due to obstructed labour. I couldn't stand the pain anymore, she told the Sydney Morning Herald during an interview. And if my baby was going to die, then I decided I would have to die too. But if he was going to grow up, I was going to see him grow up and I was going to be with my child. I thought that God would save both our lives. So she drank 3 small glasses of hard liquor, she took a kitchen knife and she sliced her abdomen 3 times to get through the skin, the fat and the muscle. And after an hour of tugging, she delivered a healthy baby boy and she was able to ask one of her children to bring a nurse before she lost consciousness. The nurse arrived, tucked her bowel loops back into her abdomen and transferred her to the nearest hospital, which was 8 hours away. Luckily, she hadn't bled much or damaged any of her other organs, and she was discharged from hospital 10 days later after having triple antibiotic therapy. So happy Caesarean Day, you wonderful people. Celebrate all of the people in your life who have had them. Thank you for watching. Why not subscribe? And I will see you tomorrow.